Maybe you heard this story about what happened earlier this week at a museum in Israel. So in Haifa, I think this happened on Tuesday, there was a museum, and in this museum, kind of at the entrance, the museum curators had put like different jars on display, and they were kind of out in the open. Anybody could kind of get to them. And what happened is a 4-year-old boy came with his parents to visit, and his parents were kind of looking in the other direction. And while they did, that little boy became very curious. So there was a jar there, and I think it was on a stand, but it wasn't really secured. And the boy was curious, what is in this jar? So he started to kind of climb up on the jar to see what was inside. And he pulled the jar open, and he discovered, okay, the jar was empty, but he also toppled the jar over, and it broke into many pieces. And his parents, of course, turned around and were horrified. They came over and they saw the jar. They were more horrified when they discovered that this jar was 3,500 years old. So it predates the time of King David, a very old jar. And the parents were horrified, the child was horrified, but the story kind of has a happy ending. The museum there realized that perhaps their exhibit wasn't the best or most properly well thought out, and they realized that this time it was an accident. So in fact, just the other day, I think, they called back this boy who was kind of ridden with guilt at this point, and they gave him an organized tour throughout the museum there. But I was reflecting on this incident, this idea of kind of things getting broken, of brokenness, while I was preparing for this homily. Because really this homily centers, or the gospel, centers on, for Jesus and his followers, what leads to brokenness. What is it that leads to division, kind of these parts of the pots dividing? What actions, what do we do that can lead to brokenness in relationships, brokenness in the world, and even brokenness and separation within ourselves? This is kind of what is debated in the gospel today. The gospel, Jesus is presented with some questions from people. They come and they begin to criticize his behavior, because many of the people at Jesus' time, the other Jewish people, had a lot of debates about what was it that led to division or separation or brokenness in our community. And the kind of terminology that they use, and it comes up in the gospel, has to do with clean and unclean. And of course, these sort of categories can seem strange to us today, but kind of in a nutshell, uncleanness was a state that someone could get to by some actions that led to separation. It kind of broke someone apart from God and broke them apart from the community. It kind of was an action like that boy did that shattered this jar. Certain actions then could lead to uncleanness, could lead to a breakdown in relationships. Now, what's important to know is that at the time of Jesus, there was a lot of debate about what these actions were. What did we do or what didn't we do that could lead to these breakdowns in relationships? And in the Bible, we find a lot of different actions there. Some of them, for example, dietary laws. You could eat certain things. Some of them moral laws as well. If you behave in a certain way, it could lead to impurity. It could lead to a breakdown in relationships with God and others. Other people added even extra traditions to what was found in, say, for example, Leviticus. And these were referred to as the tradition of the elders. And this gets referenced in the gospel today. A religious community at Jesus' time called the Pharisees, many of them tried to follow strictly these traditions of the elders. And many of them did it with good intentions, trying to grow closer to God. But they added different customs, and we hear about this. If you eat without properly washing vessels, it leads to uncleanness. And among the Jewish community, there was a lot of debate. What actions do and what actions do not break down our relationship with God and with neighbor. And Jesus really is pulled right in the midst of this debate in today's gospel. Jesus responds to this debate with a very fundamental and very profound truth. Jesus is saying that what leads to division, what leads to breakdown, what breaks things really in our world is our hearts, the intentions that we carry within our hearts. If we have, for example, malice, unforgiveness, hatred, prejudice towards others in our hearts, this in the end will lead to actions that destroy relationships. And Jesus gives at the end of the gospel an entire list of these actions. But what is so important, Jesus points to, is what is in our hearts. When our hearts are right with God and our hearts are right with others, we create unity. If, however, there is disturbance in our heart, hatred, unforgiveness, then our hearts will manifest actions that harm other people. We see then that it is our hearts that really matter. Jesus kind of highlights this by saying, what isn't what goes into a person from outside that matters. The food we eat, for example. Some at Jesus' time argued that could lead to impurity and so break relationships. Rather, Jesus says it's our hearts and how we manifest what is in our hearts that truly matters. And we see this, I think, today in kind of an extreme way, perhaps. I always kind of strikes me during election cycle where human behavior is kind of on display, where actions, words that people say about others seem so severe, kind of judging other people harshly, not seeing other people as part of our community, that we can work with one another. And this is even more profoundly amplified when we see social media. Social media in some ways is a very fine antenna for what is happening within our hearts. It can be good in some ways, but also it can manifest divisions and bring about great harm. Jesus says then that it is in our hearts when we have unforgiveness, unkindness, malice. This leads to division. This leads to separation. This is, in the end, what breaks relationships. What is the good news on the other side of the coin that Jesus doesn't quite get to in this particular gospel is that if our hearts are not right, okay, on the one hand it causes division, but if our hearts are good with God and with others, we can bring about incredible unity and goodness in our actions. We can bring about ultimately a healing of broken relationships. And we see this oftentimes in beautiful examples, very small examples, people we know that are close to us who behave in this way, but also in these great examples that get rightly so notoriety and become famous throughout the world. And I was considering, for the examples of, on the one hand, Mother Teresa, who spent time with those who were seen to be untouchable, to love them, to serve them, in that her heart was wanting to love God and neighbor, and she manifested this in her actions. Or we can see the example of St. Damien of Molokai, who chose to be with lepers, to serve them, to care for their needs. Their actions of Mother Teresa, St. Damien, and so many others didn't just impact or heal these people that they served directly, but through their witness caused kind of a chain reaction. Other people see their goodness, the healing that they bring into the world, and are inspired to do the same. In today's gospel, then, Christ reminds us that we have a choice. Each of us really can be instruments of unity in the world, or sometimes by our actions, we can bring about division or brokenness. Jesus reminds us really that it is in our hearts where either unity, disunity begin. So we pray then in this Eucharist for healing of our hearts, that we can bring to the Lord all the difficulties or struggles that we carry within our heart, maybe unforgiveness, prejudice we might hold towards others or different groups. Let us ask Christ then to heal our hearts today so that our actions and our words can bring healing and unity to those around us.